and and uh, uh, hand over to Carl. Start with your introduction.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carl Brundage. I am a principal technical architect here at Otiseva, also a certified technical architect MVP, and I help co-lead the Allentown PA developers group. Always looking for speakers there if you want to come join us. And if you want to connect with me on social, you can definitely tweet me at Carl Brundage. So today, what I'm going to talk about is deleting 3 billion records. And usually what that entails is an action, a reaction like, wait, what? What did you do? You deleted how many records? All right, I've got questions. So what I want to make sure during this session, if you have questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat at any point in time. I'll definitely look for those as I go through different topics. I'm going to share my experiences. I don't really have a lot of code today, but we can certainly talk about any of the topics more in depth if you want to. So to start off, does anybody have any questions when I say something like I deleted 3 billion records? And you can just put them in the chat. So I usually get the normal ones. Wait, what'd you do? Who'd you do it for? Why did you do it? How did you do it? So we're going to start with those type of questions. So yeah, we'll definitely get into the how. I like to start with the who, so that we understand the situation that we were in. This was one of my customers. They were a global transportation company. And like many companies' journeys into Salesforce, they wanted to move their service center from legacy onto Salesforce. And they did it in a really smart way. They started with a small set of users, and they tried to pilot out the functionality, make sure it met their needs. And then they expanded from there. And they got to a point where they had about 10,000 service users on Salesforce. They were making use of a Salesforce service console. They were making use of email to case. And I think that's an important piece for later on as to why we had to do this. And it was creating records anytime somebody emailed in. It was creating files. It was letting people communicate back and forth, everything that you would imagine from a service center. So what did we have to do? Well, if we start thinking about that setup of email to case, one of the interesting things that happens with email to case is every time an email hits your system, it's going to create a file for any attachments that are on the email. And that question, those attachments can be things that you put, maybe it's an invoice, maybe it's a picture of something, but it can also be all those little signature logos or follow us on Twitter or see our social for all the back and forth. And what happens was now you have cases, you have files, you have related information, and all that data had to come out. And over a period of time, what I ended up doing, I looked yesterday, the total is 3.2 billion records. That's not just across one object, that's across multiple objects, and about 10.5 terabytes of files. That's information that I've removed from Salesforce, but put in an archive. It's not data that is totally lost or inaccessible. We didn't remove it completely. We put it in an archive system so that users could still access it. And if you had a regulatory need or a compliance need, you could go and look up what was there. So why did I do this? Well, that's where email to case figures in. One of the things, this customer didn't hit the normal limits you might be thinking of. There wasn't a storage space limit. There wasn't a file space limit. There wasn't an API limit. There was an obscure limit, which those are the ones that usually come and bite us when we're dealing with Salesforce. Salesforce has a limit on the number of files that you can store in a content library. And it's a softish limit. It's 30 million. When you hit that 30 million, everything stops. No more emails coming in, no more emails going out because you couldn't create any more files. Salesforce increased the limit temporarily for this customer. They went up to 100 million, but said, you have to have a solution. We can't keep growing this infinitely. You have to have a way to get your data out of the system so that you can bring it back down within the limits. So that's a really important thing to understand is the why. Sometimes you look at archiving for performance or archiving for compliance. This was because Salesforce simply stopped working unless we could get data out of the system. All right, where did we do this? Well, it's one of those types of activities. I could start in a sandbox, but I'm not going to get very far, right? With the limits of size on a sandbox, I can't have archived 3 billion records. So while there might be a little bit of development that goes on in a traditional dev or dev pro sandbox, we actually were working in a full sandbox because that had some scope of data associated with it. It's a good place to test out your processes, but what's different about even a full copy sandbox, while it has the data volumes associated with production, it didn't have the usage patterns. There weren't 10,000 users doing things. There weren't the same integration processes running every day. So that's something also to keep in mind when we talk later about, what is the lessons learned moving to production. What you've done in a sandbox may not be indicative of what you're going to experience in production. The when, how did we do this? Well, starting out, there was a really big need to get data out quickly because the system was stopped. So there was 20 million cases that needed to come out very quickly, and then matching the ongoing process. So we broke this into two pieces, a backlog that we had to burn down. So we had to remove things that were already in the system, and then the steady state once you had that backlog done. And then the question that I've seen a few times was, how did we do this? How did we go about doing it? I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we did it, and then we can go into the lessons learned. But before, any other questions people want to drop in the chat to make sense the use case and the scenario we're going to go through? All right, so the how. The how was using Otiseva, but Otiseva is just a solution. There's a lot of knowledge that you need to have on how you're going to archive and the things to consider. And that's what I'm going to share next, was how I went about doing that. If we think about archiving, archiving is generally going to fall into 3 steps. And these are big high-level steps. But the first thing you have to do some sort of identification. And that's identification of 2 different things. It's identification of what do you need to archive, the scope of objects and related objects, but also the records you want to archive. You're not going to take everything out of the system. You're going to have some subset. And what's interesting about identification, most people, they'll start saying, oh, just take cases that are older than 2 years. But that simple kind of view of logic, that breaks down pretty quickly, because once business gets involved, there's a lot of other conditions. Oh, unless it's a high value account, or, oh, this account has an open critical parent case, don't do that. Or, oh, this has parent cases, it's a parent of other children, well, don't archive it. And now you've created this really complex logic that if you even try to put a where clause on, if you can, it's probably going to time out. So identification, it can start simple, but generally it's going to get very complicated very quickly. So you need to think about whether you're going to directly query records, or you're going to use batch apex to mark them or identify them in other ways. The next phase, you've identified what you need to pull out. You've identified the records. Now you're going to do the archival. And the archival, to me, is where you're backing data out of Salesforce. You're retrieving information. You're getting these 100,000 cases, the million associated records, the files, and you're putting them somewhere. And that can be another system, database. It could be S3, it could be Azure, wherever you're going to store the locations. And then the last step is the deletion, right? You have to go back into Salesforce, and to complete an archive, you're going to have to delete something. And deleting can be interesting, right? Reading out information from Salesforce, that's generally not going to create locks or block you from doing other activities. But once you start deleting, now you have transactions that are executing. Now you're locking those records. You may be locking parent records. So you need to think about the impact that delete's going to have. And there's some other options in how you delete that we'll talk about later, whether you're doing it with the bulk API or the SOAP API and so forth. So that's a little bit about the how. Now, what have I learned along the way? And if there's questions about the how, definitely put them into the chat, and I'll be sure to go a little bit deeper in it. So the first lesson for me is know why you're doing this. Are you doing this because you've been running Salesforce for 10 years and you have a lot of obsolete data? And that obsolete data really it doesn't need to be in Salesforce anymore. Nobody has a need to look at it. You're not using it for business calculations or targeting or CSAT satisfactions or even analytics or AI purposes. If it is so, that's something you can kind of park on the side, right? You can put it into, if we kind of use the old terms, a cold archive. If you ever had experience with databases, you'd have your hot backup, which is right there by the data center, and you have your cold backup, which you'd ship off site, but it would take longer to retrieve. You can do the same thing here. You can take and you can put that data in a file. You can put it on S3. You can put it on S3 Glacial. You have it in case you need it, but you're not expecting to use it. The flip side is, hey, maybe we still need to have business access to this data. We need to know what the cases were from last year. We need the cases from last year in order to calculate predicted case satisfaction ratings this year because we look back a year in our analytics or in our AI. So that may be a reason that could impact what you archive or how you need to access the data once it's been archived. So that's the other piece, is access. Who needs access? Is that something that just an administrator will need periodically? Maybe they're responding to a request from legal, or no, we want our users in order to go back and see, all right, this is what the case looked like, because occasionally they'll get a question from it. Maybe you're also archiving for limits. The common one I see is data or storage, whether it's files or the records themselves. You've hit a place where you don't want to add more to Salesforce, and then you're looking most likely for obsolete records, because honestly, if you're going to build another system that maintains business access to the data, it's probably cheaper just to buy the storage from Salesforce, because otherwise you're building other systems, you're building access, all those things, just buy the storage. Maybe conversely, you've hit a performance bottleneck. You simply can't get reports to run. You can't get a list view to return because you have too much data. Again, that's a good reason to archive it and then consider, is it a business need or are you just parking it on the side? And I do see a question, how easy is it to restore records? So definitely we'll come back to that as one of the lessons learned. So I'm not ignoring that. I'll just hit it a little bit later in the presentation. And then questions about, how long it takes to delete. I'll make sure I hit that too. All right, the next lesson for me, embrace big numbers. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, let's just think about that. This particular example, we had about 200,000 cases a day that were being created. So, okay, I need to archive 200,000 records. Well, what about the related records? How many case comments? How many case feeds? How much case history are you generating? What's the multiple that you're creating? Is it 5x, 10x, 20x, or more? In my example, it was about 20x. So for 200,000 cases, I was getting about 4 million total records every time I needed to archive. So think about that. Every day I need to pull 400 million records out of Salesforce. I need to delete 4 million records. So that's something that's easy to overlook, is how big these numbers get. You only have 24 hours in a day, right? But if your process doesn't complete, what happens to the next day's run? The flip side of big numbers is they add up fast. And I know it sounds kind of crazy to say, but just think about your project. I'm going to do this archiving. I'm generating 200,000 cases a day. What if my project took a week? It's not even a long time, right? A week. Doing things in a week is pretty darn fast. But in a week's time, I've generated almost 1.5 million cases and 28 total records. What if my project takes a little bit longer? It takes a month to do. Now I'm at 6 million and 124 million. What if it has to go through approvals and change control? And I do it in a quarter, which still, some of you are thinking, a quarter to do something significant like that is pretty fast. Now I'm at 18 million and 375 million. So the cost of delaying getting an archive up and running means you have that many more records in your backlog that you have to process. So in my example, we got some information out fast, but there was a lot of other changes they want. And it took a long time within the organization to decide what to do, to the point where I had hundreds of millions of records that I had to figure out, how do I get these out? How do I create processes that can run in parallel so that I can do 3 archiving runs a day in order to burn down this backlog and get to steady state? And that's where waiting made it that much worse. Or, oh, I built a process and it didn't work. and nobody watched that process and it didn't work for a week. Well, now how do you catch back up? If you can't do things in parallel, you can't have 2 runs running at once, then you're never going to burn down that backlog. So big numbers, definitely you have to think about them. The next lesson, I think, is really understanding Salesforce data. And there's a couple of things that come into effect. One of them is understanding selectivity. And what do I mean by that? It's going to the query cheat sheet and knowing when is an index going to execute. And if you haven't seen this, I think I can open up for you. This has your index rules in it. So depending upon whether you're using a standard index or a custom index, you can't really access more than 100 million records at a time, or you're going to fall into a full table scan. What does the full table scan mean? It means it's going to be slow, right? So if I want to pull out 1.1 million records from a 60 million record case object, it's not going to use the index, and it's going to look at all 60 million cases. If you're trying to query that with REST, it may time out. If you're trying to query it with bulk, your bulk batch may time out. It'll do the 15 retries, and then it ultimately may fail. You can try PK chunking. You have to be aware of the limits in your Salesforce org. You only get 15,000 batches a day. You may have other integration processes that prevent that. So thinking about how you can target data in a way that the where clause is going to apply, it's going to hit an index, and you're going to be able to get that information out in a timely manner. So that's where, the simple logic of where a created date or a closed date or a system modified date works really well. If you're pulling something like a text field, well, it better have either an index on it because you asked Salesforce to do it, or you made it an external ID, so it has an index on it. These things affect the ability to pull out data. The other thing that comes into play is data skew. If you're not familiar with data skew, that's when you have maybe one record with more than 10,000 children on it. In this example, the customer had a lot of internal cases that were created. Think I'm forwarding this to the support center to create a case on behalf of my customer. Those were all getting assigned to one account. So we had some enormous data skew where we had hundreds of thousands of cases on one particular account. So that made it difficult sometimes to pull out the data, and then more importantly, to delete the data because of the effect in there. The other thing you need to know when it comes to Salesforce data is know what's related. Know what is in the, know what's in, oops, sorry, I can go back to the slides. Know what is in a cascade delete mode. Well, what's cascade delete? If you think about it, the relationships, you can have parent, child, so master detail, or you can have a lookup. If it's a master detail, when I delete something, it's going to delete the children. So if I delete the case, it's going to delete the case comment. It's going to delete the case team. If I've created a custom object, let's just call it survey, and it looks up to the case, what's going to happen is I'll delete the case, but the custom object remains. Its lookup is just going to be blank. So you have different things that are going to happen in Salesforce based off of how your data is related. And you need to consider that. Last thing you want to do if you're archiving and deleting is go, oops, I didn't think about that object. I don't have it in the archive. So how do you go back and get the related objects for 20 million cases that you deleted? Well, you can't. So that's where you have to make sure you know the object model, you go through it and are ready to go. All right, next lesson. And if you've listened to some of my talks before, you've heard me say files are hard, and they still remain hard. One of the things that's different about working with files than the attachment is there are 3 objects that come into play. The content document has the header information. This is a text file. Its name is abc.txt. Content version holds the actual binary. You can have multiple versions if you are doing something where you're revising and updating the same file. It happens more. I've seen it if you're building like account plans for Salesforce on an account. Cases, it's usually not the situation. There's usually only one content version because email the case is what's creating it. And then content document link, and content document link goes and says, hey, this content goes to this case or this email message. What makes it difficult is content document link has special access rules. You just can't go in and query and say, oh, give me all the content document links. You have to put a where clause where it is either the related ID or the document ID. So you have to always have a where clause with either one or multiple values associated with it. So it's not something where you can just get that table in its entirety. You have to be very selective and specific about how you query things out. The other thing that comes into play with files is they're not supported in the bulk API. So if you have hundreds of millions of files that you have to remove, you're doing them one at a time. When you're dealing with them one at a time, you're also downloading them based off of the size of the file. So you could have 2 gigs of data that you have to download, and that could be 3 files that make up the 2 gigs, or it could be 300 files. So I'm curious, what do you people think is going to take longer to deal with? Multiple small files or fewer large files? Put it in your thoughts in the chat. Oh, everybody's going for small so far. Large, multiple, small. So yeah, what I found is the small, and it's not necessarily the Salesforce side. It is the fact that when you're pulling these out, you're going to write them somewhere. So doing those many small writes usually is slower than getting a 1 gig file. Now, what you do have to be cognizant of is if you're dealing with a large file, what happens if you drop the connection? Are you going back? Are you starting that file again? Are you being able to pick up? So there are some things where you can be interrupted in writing a large file that you need to handle in your processing, but the small files, writing them to your storage location usually takes a lot longer. So in this example, email to case, lots of little signature things, follow us on social. It took a long time. It took maybe 10, 12 hours to pull out 25 gigs every day because you were doing so many small files, doing it one at a time. The next lesson to learn is kind of if we move from retrieving data to now deleting data, know the 3 stages of delete. So I think we're all familiar with 1 and 2. 1 is the recycle bin. When you delete something in Salesforce or you delete with the SOAP API, all it does is change is deleted from false to true. So you could still query that record. You could query it out and say where is deleted equals true. Make sure you have all rows. You can still see it. It'll sit there until the recycle bin is purged. It can be there until the recycle bin gets full. So if it reaches a size that's a percentage of your data storage, it'll start purging the old records automatically, or it'll get purged after 15 days. Those situations move you into a hard delete. You can also initiate a hard delete directly. If you go through the bulk API, you can say, I want to hard delete this, and it'll bypass the recycle bin. That can be a more performant delete in many cases, but you're not going to recover it. In either example, what happens is it's not actually purged from the Salesforce database yet. There is a Salesforce sweeper process that comes through and removes that from the system. So I have seen some situations where if you have deleted some things, they're not actually gone yet. And what does that mean? Well, it means it impacts your indexes because your indexes still have the database indexes still have those records in them. So your thresholds may be thrown off, your performance may be thrown off. If you've deleted a lot of records, when do the Salesforce indexes rebuild so that your next query can be performant? I've had many a process that fails one night and runs the next day. Well, what's going on? Well, in this case, we worked with Salesforce to have a regular reindex of different objects so that these statistics were up to date and you could query things out. So again, not something that you necessarily see if you are dealing with 10 records or 1,000 records, but when you start deleting tens of millions, billions of records, these factors come in. I'm going to go back to the previous slide for a second because there was a question that came in, and there's a question of, can you do any of the file processing in parallel so it doesn't take 10 to 12 hours? And the answer is yes, to a point. One of the things that happens, you can set a query to say, give me 200 files. And then when you spool them out, you have to spool them one at a time. So you can do things in parallel, but what's going to happen is if you start creating separate processes, Salesforce has a limit of the number of cursors that you can have open. From a database perspective, cursor is a locator into a specific set of data based off a query that you did. Once you go over 10, then you hit a error that says invalid cursor locator. And what will happen is it'll automatically kill your oldest process. So if you kind of try and go massively parallel, you're going to start breaking the oldest one and have to have really good retry logic. If you get to a point where maybe it's not cursors, maybe you've pulled out the data and you're just waiting for something to download and you start putting multiple processes through, Salesforce has a different limit. They have a limit of the number of connections that have long-running queries. This is API requests that have long-running queries. This is different than the internal one. And I believe that one is set to 15 for production instances. So again, you can go parallel to a point, but then if you don't have really good controls over the processes that run and how you handle errors, all you're going to do is run a process that breaks your oldest running process, and you really aren't going to make any progress in your backlog work. So thanks for that question, Peter. All right, so we know the 3 stages of delete. We're starting deleting data. We're coming in and we're saying, all right, I'm going to do a hard delete. So I have to do it with the bulk API. That's the only API that supports it. And now that I'm deleting, I want to make sure I'm working with Salesforce. I'm not going to work against the system, right? We talked before about a cascade delete. So those objects that are master detail. If I delete the case, it's going to delete the case comments for me. So when I'm thinking about how I want to delete, I shouldn't bother deleting case comments. It's going to do it for me automatically if I just get the case. Same thing, case history, case team. So that's where we can delete a large scope of data by just deleting one object. The other thing when we're doing a delete, we don't need to keep all the other fields that we backed up. We only need the Salesforce ID. We can mix different things together. And notice I say, many with one delete until it doesn't work. What do I mean by that? Well, there's limits to how much data Salesforce can delete with one batch. I mentioned data skew before. So I had the situation where one account owned many cases. Some of those cases were actually used for system monitoring. So a system would come in, put a case comment on it, record the response time, see what that is. So you had situations where these records had hundreds of thousands of case histories on them. Well, if you try and delete something that creates too big of a delete batch, Salesforce will error. So then you need to be able to control the batch size. So instead of deleting 10,000 cases at once, maybe I could only do 2,000 or 100. So that would have to scale up and down based off of the different items that were happening. The other thing that starts happening when you're using the bulk API, you can use it in one of 2 modes. You can use it in the serial mode or the parallel mode. With serial, if I have 200,000 cases and I'm doing them in batches of 10,000, it's going to create the 20 batches and it's going to run them one after another. So it's going to delete the first 10,000, the next 10,000, 10,000 after that. What that does for you is it prevents one batch from locking another batch. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I have a case that I'm going to delete, what happens when I delete a case is it locks the account and the contact associated with it. I think that's, let me see if I still have the cheat sheet here. So if we look at the cheat sheet, nope, it's not this one. There's another cheat sheet on record locking. If you look up the record locking one, I don't have it here at my fingertips, but it will show you that, hey, deleting a case locks the account and the contact. So if I have case 1, to my account in batch 1, and I have case 2 also to my account in batch 2, what's going to happen is if I run them in serial, no problem. This runs, deletes, locks the account. This one runs down here, locks the same account. It can take longer. It can take longer because you're doing things in serial. You're waiting for everything to complete before the next thing completes. If you do it in parallel, it's going to put the batches side by side and it's going to run them at the same time. So now you have the chance of this account is in batch 1 and this account is in batch 2. When you delete the cases, they're both going to try and lock it. And the second one's going to fail. And what's going to happen is the batch will fail and it'll tell you, could not attain exclusive lock to this record. And it'll retry up to 15 times and then it'll fail the batch. So you have this situation of, well, it kind of seems logical. I should probably wait and do everything in serial. So what do you think? What way did I end up deleting? Did I delete in serial or did I delete in parallel? And you can throw things in the chat. Oh, everybody's going with parallel so far. So my answer is both. I'll tell you why it's both in 2 slides. But the main way I did it was parallel, and I did embrace the errors. What do I mean by that? I made use of retrying both within the batch itself, and if I failed, to download the records that failed and then retry those things. Because what I found was, while serial prevented any type of locking, I couldn't delete at the volume that I needed to. So I needed to embrace those errors. I did some things to mitigate it. When I was preparing my deletes, rather than just taking cases willy-nilly, I ordered them and I said, give me all the cases ordered by the account and then the contact, to try and keep things in the same batches to reduce the amount of errors. Didn't always work. Remember, I had that, that data skew that definitely came into play because it took a very long time to do those. But between having multiple processes and then adjusting my batch size, it was really key to being able to get out and delete 3 billion records. So the second part of files is they're still hard when it comes to deleting. Deleting the case does not delete the file. If I delete the case, then what happens is only that content document link is removed. The files themselves stay. So in addition to deleting the case, I'd have a separate process that went back and said, oh, content document, we're going to delete content document, and then that would get rid of the document and the document link. So just because you're targeting one object for archiving, it doesn't mean that that's the only thing you have to think of when it comes to a delete. Otherwise, files were pretty easy. The customer did have some automations built into files where they had triggers and I want to say it was flows, it might have been process builders, making sure that there's ways to bypass those for our user as well too, so that automation didn't slow down the process. And those are some of the lessons learned around files. All right, now with a global company, there really weren't a whole lot of off hours. This wasn't an example of, hey, we run on the East Coast from 9 to 5, so you can have from 5 to 9 to do whatever you want. So this is where we had to really pay attention to the locks and the effects that locks had. That deleting of a case could impact somebody's ability to put another case comment on a case because updating a case because updating a case would try and lock that same account. So if we think about the 3 steps I said before, identification, archival, and delete, it's really important to be able to separate those into processes that run on their own. So from an archival or backup perspective, I could back up 24/7, 365. I could run several processes at once. To some of the questions before, I could get data out very quickly. Reading data from Salesforce, other than the few limits we talked about, that wasn't impacting users. It wasn't affecting something. But the second I started deleting, sometimes they would see errors in Salesforce that you couldn't lock this record. So when I said I did things in serial and in parallel, what ended up happening was we had a window during the week of lower activity. This was when Oceania was during their workday. That was a low activity for this customer. There would be a process that would delete cases in serial mode. So it limited the ability to lock records inside of Salesforce. Then on the weekend, so between Friday night, Central European time, and then Monday morning, Oceania time, we were able to delete more things. So we were able to run a process in parallel that did it and would handle the errors. So then I had my data skew issues, right? I had these records that it just would not delete. And I got really obscure Salesforce errors. They were errors that made no sense whatsoever. It was, what was it? It was basically looked like it was almost a duplicate error, which made no sense whatsoever. But what I was able to do was able to trace it back to the records that had account data skews. So what I ended up doing is I also deleted in SOAP. So anything that experienced massive data skew, I put in scope with a batch size of 1. So I would only delete these cases one at a time. Yes, this was absolutely the slowest of the 3 options, but when I had a set of records that I couldn't otherwise remove, I had to figure out a way to do it. And that was a way to get around the data skew and to avoid blocks in the system. So the answer to before of how do I delete it, I deleted every way I could, every way possible in order to get that out. So let's see, there's a question. Are there analytics that provide guidance around resource consumption and even batches that run purge and archive? I'm not aware of anything published out there. It was a lot of experience that I had and really understanding what went on in that Salesforce org, because each org is different and it's really the data itself that was doing it. Yes, you can go into Dev Console and you can see query plans. So if you put in a SOQL statement in Dev Console, there's a button down at the bottom that will say query plan. That will show you the analytics of how your query runs. If you don't see that in Dev Console, go up to settings. You have to enable it. You can also get that through the API as well. I use the cheat sheets that you saw, the one for indexes. I use the cheat sheet for record locking. So those give some general guidance. And then really just the experience of what am I seeing? What's happening? This doesn't make sense. Why am I getting this error? And oh, it's this record. Oh, this record has data skew, and tracking down those specific cases. So another question, seems like perhaps the data and file volumes could have been projected prior to the customer's initial Salesforce launch. Would you recommend setting up all these processes ahead of time? So yes, let's see. One of the things that is a lesson learned is if you're thinking about archiving when you need to archive, it's already too late. You need to think about how you're going to archive, what's the reasons, what's the related data, where are we going to store it, how are we going to access it before that need comes up. Because yes, you can absolutely think about projections. One of the things that's interesting in this case, I didn't set up the customer initially, but if you ran the numbers on licenses and data storage and file storage, there wasn't an issue. They have plenty of data storage and file storage. They hit the number of files, which is a more obscure limit. So even if you project it, if you can get caught by something that you didn't expect. In terms of dollars, would you be able to talk about the savings? You also mentioned where the users could see past data. I might have missed that. Yes. So with Otis Eva, so the company I work for, we offer 2 versions of archiving. One is put the files on the side in a CSV and you can go search for them. You can use AWS, you can put Elasticsearch on it, however you want to find something that's been archived. That serves the compliance or obsolete data very well of maybe once in 3 years, somebody needs to go find something. The other option we provide is a more visual option where we virtualize the data that comes out and you have an interface that looks like Salesforce. You could also do it with external objects, but something where then the data is not in Salesforce, but users can still access it. And that serves the use cases where you're trying to deal with performance, you're trying to deal with this limit, but there still is a business need to access it. In both cases, it kind of, those questions fit into the next point, which is either preparing for restore or preparing for how you're going to access it. Once you remove it, will you need to put it back or at least see it? Probably. I've had 2 or 3 requests in the past year and a half to look at something in the archive or pull something out of the archive and restore it. It does come up from time to time. And again, waiting until it's needed, that can be too late. Restore can definitely be tricky. What happens when the metadata changes? I've added more fields to the case. How do I restore that? I've taken fields away from the case. How do I restore that? I changed a field from optional to required, right? So thinking through the process to either provide access or the process to get it back. Same thing, your data changes. This user is no longer active. Well, you try and restore that back into Salesforce, it's going to produce an error for you as well too. So thinking about how you're going to access it, whether it's searching files, whether it's providing a visual to it with product like Go2Seva or with external objects, however you want to do it. But again, that's at the start of the project, not when somebody comes and says, oops, we made a mistake, we need that back, because usually they need it back very quickly and you won't have time to figure it out. All right, so if I were to summarize the things to keep in mind, it starts with knowing the why. Why are you archiving? Why are you pulling out this data? Because that's going to inform some of the decisions and things you need to think about. You have to absolutely think in terms of big numbers, do the math, and then project forward what it means, how much you have to pull out, what it's going to do if you have to work down a backlog. Plan before you need it. That is both from a need for archiving as well as the need for restore. Don't work against Salesforce. Use Salesforce to your advantage. Know where things are going to get tricky, whether it's indexes, whether it's relationships. Make sure you have that data. Make sure you delete that data. You'll always hear me say files are hard. So, the thought of even keeping files out of Salesforce, there's definitely a lot of benefit for that. There are no off hours in many of these companies now. So don't think that you have this period of time where you can just delete everything and lock down the system. That's becoming more and more rare in global. And then don't overlook restore. Make sure you have it. All right, so questions. Keep the questions coming. Definitely, this is everything that I have prepared to talk about, so happy to go in any direction. So was events and notes and tasks part of this delete? If so, yes, what were the challenges? Yes to activities, so that was events and tasks. Notes, I believe this was, the notes were stored as files for this customer, so that followed the file ones. They were not extensive task and event driven. So I know I've run into some customers with hundreds and hundreds of millions of records in here. We were also archiving on a fairly short time frame. What do I mean by that? This wasn't a situation because it was a new customer where we had 10 years of case history and we were taking things from a long time ago. It was to a point where essentially every closed case gets archived within 9 months of it being closed. So it's pretty aggressive. So tasks were not really building up. What you have to be cognizant of, Salesforce has its own notion of archiving a task, which just changes where you can see it, but the data still resides in there. So if you have a lot of tasks that have piled up and you have archive tasks in there, there's a different API mode that you need to set to say, I can view archive tasks to make sure those get pulled out. What is the route we've taken to disable validation triggers for all the objects in these standard scripts? So this is going to the concept of bypass strategies. And most people are pretty familiar now with having bypasses on your triggers, on your code, whether that's a trigger handler pattern, custom metadata, flags on the users, some way to bypass triggers. So it was making sure that those development pieces were in place for the objects that we were associated with. Our product will go through and check those things for you. Obviously, with any of the click-based automations, that's not something you can just turn off. Well, you can, but you turn it off for everybody, right? So when we're archiving, we can't shut down Salesforce because we need to delete a few million records. We need to keep those things running. So again, making sure there's bypasses built into the click-based metadata as well too, so that it didn't affect it. Fortunately, validation rules usually hurt you more with restore. It was some of the automations, so making sure when things were updated or deleted that they weren't infected there. All right, other questions? So everybody's ready to go archive? All right, well, if there isn't anything else, I'll throw it back to the Apex Hours team to close this out. Oh, can you archive marketing cloud data? Snuck one in there. You can, but the question would be, if you think about marketing cloud, there's some built-in things where you can get data out. I haven't done marketing cloud in a while, but I know you can automate the creation of CSVs on the FTP. So the question becomes, if you're using that for journeys or other pieces inside of marketing cloud, then if you're going to pull it out, making sure you have it more in another system so that you can provide the APIs back in. So again, it comes down to, why are you trying to archive? Is it too much data? Are things slow? Do you still have a business need? I haven't done a lot of archive projects, so definitely, if you have a business need, I'd be interested to learn more about, why you want to archive. So send me a message on Twitter at Carl Brundage. Is Salesforce now doing archive and restore? So Salesforce, historically, they provided a data recovery service, which was if you did something wrong with your data, you could contact them within a long period of time, many weeks. They'd go for the database logs, pull you back a CSV, and then you could load it back in for a fee. They have since discontinued that product and added a backup product inside of Salesforce where you can set up some different policies and have some restore. Again, there's multiple players out there. We do backup, other companies do backup. I would just compare the differences and see what meets your needs. If you have the need for security and performance and thinking through these restores, whether or not particular products suit your needs. So yeah, there's options out there. You just have to evaluate what you need versus what they do. Again, whether you use a third party or Salesforce, just evaluate what you're getting with the third party and the benefits of it. Salesforce product's relatively new. I think you'll see it continue to evolve over time, like most Salesforce things now. All right, any last questions? If not, thanks for the questions today. Thanks for the attention. It was fun to kind of share some of my experiences, some of my scars from going through this. Definitely wasn't perfect. There was a lot of learnings along the way. And then the slides themselves won't be shared, but the presentation will be available on the Apex Hours. So the recording will be there.